I'm happy to tell you about a little bit about my background. So I guess the short story is um, it really channeled a lot of my energy early on into first academic success and then career success, financial success. Success to me, what I learned growing up and in this culture is that success is you succeed in business, you do really well in school, and then you get a job that's going to pay you really well. And you're going to get prestige through that, and you're going to be able to buy stuff and all of that. And so I really kind of doubled down on that. And I started my own company when I was 34. It was a consulting company, marketing, human resources. And I channeled all of my energy into growing it. I called it my baby. Even after I had my first human child, I called it my first baby without any sense of irony. It was a huge part of me. And I don't want to dismiss all of it. I got so much out of it, and I enjoyed building it. It was special, but I was out of balance for sure. And I really think that I had internalized without knowing. I don't think anybody sat me down and said being feminine is bad or being soft is like a terrible thing. But I feel like I internalized all those messages that you get from our culture. So
subconsciously we do.
Right. And so I wanted to show up as tough and strong. And I really thought that being a feminist meant that I would show up and I would succeed in places that hadn't been open to my mother or my grandmother. Like, that is what it meant to be a feminist, to walk into these male spaces and be like, look at me, guys, I can do this too, without ever understanding that, hey, maybe that space wasn't designed for women, period. Maybe why am I trying to succeed in a space that was never ever took my needs and my desires and my skills into consideration? That just wasn't part of my worldview. So I, really doubled down. I was focused on growing the business, and that was great for several years. I did that. And then I went to a business conference one day and just had this really wild, very much in-body experience that I was not expecting. I was there to win new clients. I was there with 5,000 other women. And, I still had a small business, compared to these corporate clients. So I was there to win a big corporate client for my company. And instead, I heard this woman speak. Her name is Dr. Elizabeth Kapualani Lindsay, and she's an anthropologist and a National Geographic Fellow, the first Native Hawaiian National Geographic Fellow. And she was talking about indigenous wisdom. She was describing Polynesian wayfinders and how they could travel these thousands of miles between islands without any instrumentation. But what she was really talking about was, she was talking about intuition and heart knowing. She said something about that as she was describing this. Her voice was so beautiful, so lilting. I feel like I can still hear it in my head. And she said something about these sailors being so in tune with their hearts that they could travel these distances just by watching the way the waves broke across the front of the boat.
Unbelievable. That's just unbelievable.
The idea of that blew my mind, first of all, because it was so counter to just our rational, logic-driven, data-driven world. But I had a physical reaction to her words, and I had never had anything like that happen. And it was dramatic. I got hot from my feet, all the way up to the top of my head. And
wow.
And I started getting really tingly. And then the whole room looked like it was kind of shimmering and receding. And then I found that for a moment, it was like trying to hear underwater. Or it's like somebody stuck wax in my ears or something. And it was just this huge, huge moment. And I don't want to make it sound scary at all. It was spectacular. It was amazing. And it really felt like very much like a before and after moment, or to quote, I'm going to age myself here, but to quote Back to the Future, there was a rip in the time-space continuum.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah. And I could
right with you.
Yeah. And I could see through it, or I just felt like all of a sudden somebody had just been like, hey, there's something so much bigger here than what you've been doing. Pay attention. I'm talking to you. And so it was like, I felt like I had to answer it. So, that day I was useless. I forgot all about trying to win my corporate clients. And I was like, whatever. I was on my phone, Googling wayfinders, because that's the name of these Polynesian navigators, which is a side note, I should say, probably a lot more people know about them perhaps now, especially if you have kids, because the movie Moana kind of put them on the
Yes.
map. But this was about 4 years before, 3 or 4 years before Moana. So I didn't have any
Mhm.
reference point.
Mhm.
So that moment was huge. It set me on a path of trying to learn about these wayfinders. I didn't see any connection to the feminine at that point. I just was like, oh, this is something I need to know about. So I started reading about first about these wayfinders, and then that kind of led me to other indigenous wisdom and other like shamanic traditions and things like that. And I should note that a lot of what I was reading was written by white men, anthropologists who were out studying these cultures. I didn't understand at the time that that's an important distinction. I get it now. Like people should be able to speak for their own cultures. But regardless of that, I was still getting enough to give me a sense of being in the world in a different way. And above all, that this rational, logical, data-driven world that we live in is not the only world, and it is not the only way of knowing. And nothing in my life up until that point had told me that I had other options of how to view the world. So it was so beneficial to have that opening. But it wasn't until I was pregnant with my second child when this happened. And it wasn't until my son was born that I saw the threads of the feminine specifically coming in. And I had him unmedicated without an epidural. And it was a very, very painful. And my first child was not. I had the medication. I was totally all into the Western medical interventions. But this was different. And it was horribly, horribly painful. But it was another opening of sorts of seeing like what it could look like to partner with this energy that is so much bigger than us, because that's what was moving through me. It was this life force energy like coming through my body. And we lock up and we resist and we do all this stuff. But if I could just relax even into the pain and allow it, then I could partner with this energy, and everything happens so much faster and more fluid when we work together like that. And I felt in the moments after my son was born, just this incredible connection to ancestral women, and not just my lineage, but just women, like women who had done this since the beginning of time. Like I could feel it. And so I went home with my baby, like all on this high, and started thinking about how odd it was that in all my spiritual seeking in the last several months, and plus even before that, I just had never heard anybody talk about the spiritual nature of childbirth.
Yes.
And I wondered, where is that? Like, why? Surely I cannot be the only person that felt that this is like the most spiritual experience I could ever have in my life.
And how about all the doctors were men, and all the people that wrote instructions and books on them and teachings were male who've never had children?
Exactly. I
Or
mean, even now,
given birth to children.
absolutely. Even now, some of the best ones that are known, are men.
Mhm.
And that was the realization that hit me one day. I was holding my baby and I was thinking about, these spiritual experiences, and why am I not reading? This is annoying to me. Like, because the stuff that I'd been exploring, the
Yeah.
indigenous wisdom, again, I want to note, written mostly by white men. So
Yeah.
might have had a different experience if I'd had indigenous people educating me. But what I was reading, it was really, I felt enlightened stuff, and yet I still didn't see the feminine. And
Yeah.
it was just a moment one morning when I realized, well, the stories of women's spiritual experiences, they're not here. And that's why I'm not reading about them. I'm reading stories from men, and they can't tell me about what they haven't experienced. And that really sent me on a little bit of a Rolodex of I grew up in a Protestant church, and God was a man, and God's
Mhm.
beloved child is a man, and all of his disciples are men. And the only thing we ever heard about his mother was at Christmas. And I always had male preachers. They didn't even allow deacons, which were kind of this, people that helped out in the church, until I was older, like to be women. Those were all men. Women couldn't be ordained. Like it was just, even in, going back to some of the things that I'd studied, taken some courses in Buddhism, been taught by men. Now I know there are women practitioners, but at that moment, it all kind of reinforced this absence of a female perspective. And it was just crushing to me initially, but very quickly it just turned into this deep skepticism of like, this can't be right.